So I'm not a full-time journalist. I mean, how could I be? Journalists traditionally, or at least their editors, really dislike the Oxford comma. But I have taken some journalism classes, 3 of them to be specific, in my master's program when I was getting an MA in English. These professors were so incredible to work with. I mean, they're amazingly published and highly respected. But mostly what stood out to me was how different they wrote from a lot of the traditional English literature education I've received up until this point. So here is 5 lessons that I learned in 3 graduate level classes that hopefully you can get in just a couple of minutes as opposed to hundreds of hours and many dollars worth of study. So here comes lesson number 1. Great titles. Journalists are all about the titles, the headlines as they call them. And there's a lot of different ways you can do headlines. You can have them be referential or puns or short yet powerful, or clickbait. I don't necessarily recommend you using clickbait titles for your research papers, but there's something to be said about this idea of immediately thinking of your reader when you're coming up with your title and making sure that the reader is going to want to pick this up. That even if you are a poet and you're just waxing in the grass and the shade thinking about clouds or whatever it might be, that if you want this to be published, you really need a title that makes people interested in reading it, and journalists know all about great titles. This goes right into lesson number 2, which is keeping the reader in mind. So one of my professors had this really interesting illustration to describe what he considered journalism. And what he asked us to envision was this great hill. And on top of the hill is you, the journalist. And at the bottom of the hill is the reading public. And the thing about the hill is, because you're up there and they're down here, you have a better view of what's happening. Not because you're some sort of elite, enlightened individual, but because you're a journalist. You've gone out there to get the story or interview whoever it might be, and therefore you have a better view. Other people could join you up on that hill, but chances are they'd rather just read about it than, drive to the scene or do all the investigating themselves. Because they're not necessarily journalists, and a journalist's job is to do those things. So because you're up on that hill, even though you have a view of everything, the people down below only really have a view of you, specifically your backside. So your job is to convey your view to the individuals down below, and to always keep the reader in mind, to realize that you might have spent many hours knee deep in this sort of story, but your readers are approaching it with maybe just a couple of minutes, maybe less, devoted out of their day to tackle whatever issue this is. So you have to write for your readers. You're up on that hill, they're down at the bottom. How can you tell them what's happening from your viewpoint? Another huge lesson that goes along with keeping the readers in mind and probably having a good headline is brevity. In journalism, space is money. And even though journalism has transitioned from the page to the web, space is still really significant. There's readers out there who will look at an article, and if it's pretty long, they won't even bother reading it. I've been in that position before, certainly. So you've got to get your point across. You've got to get your point across quickly, and you cannot waste the reader's time. Just the fact that you want to write about something, whether it's journalism, poetry, fiction, research, whatever it might be, means you're interested in it, and means you're kind of a go-getter, or at least you have an assignment that you are gonna actually do. And that can make us a little self-indulged, a little self-righteous about, oh, doesn't everyone want to read my enlightened words? I've definitely been guilty of this myself. So you have to make sure you're not wasting anyone's time. You've got to just be respectful of their time, no matter how great a writer is. No one really wants to read 100 extra words or 10 pages more or 100 pages more than they have to get the essence out of the writing. They want to get it in a concise format. That doesn't mean it's short. There's a long history of feature articles which are really long and sometimes become full-length books. But still, the journalist is concise no matter what the word count is or the length of the piece. All right, tip number 4 is one that I've carried with me ever since this class because it's the only reason I survived these classes, and that is speed. When you are a journalist, you have to start working on your assignment as soon as you get it. Like the minute you get it, you have got to dive right into it. Because in journalism, if you're a couple days late, forget about it. Someone else has written about it, or it's yesterday's news. And in the era of, the internet, if you're a couple hours late, same thing. So you've got to be right on top of it. Now, obviously, when you're writing fiction or a research paper or something like that, you're not necessarily under that sort of deadline, but there still probably is a deadline, whether it be imposed by a professor or yourself, so that it actually gets done one day. Committing to working on this piece as soon as you can is so important. That doesn't mean you sit down and start typing immediately. That's not what journalists do, but it means you start coming up with a plan. You allow yourself permission to think about your paper. It sounds simplified and kind of dumb, but just thinking about your research paper is a huge first step. Just allowing your brain time to percolate on the thoughts and generate ideas, and then being ready to write those ideas down and look at those notes in the future. That is huge. So as soon as you get something that you should be writing, start working on it in some way, shape, or form, and let that momentum carry you to a first draft so you can improve it and continue to polish it well before it's due. And tip number 5, another one that has changed my writing so much, even though I'm not in journalism classes anymore, is the interview. This was something I never used in undergrad. I was like a library addict in undergrad. I was going through the reference shelves and I was going through the databases, but journalism is all about interviewing. It's getting off your seat and going and knocking on doors and talking to people. And even if you're not writing news or feature pieces like that, an interview might still be a useful source for you. And it's probably an underutilized one for your professor or your teacher's, assignment. So consider doing it. I've used it since. A lot of experts in the field will be happy to video call with you if you ask them well enough in advance and you give them, an idea of what you're going to be asking them about. A lot of people are excited to talk about the things they care about. So don't just read your sources. Don't just be in the library. As much as I love the library, trust me, I do. I love it so much. But there's something about going out there and talking to someone or video calling with someone and getting an extra perspective and a current perspective that can be so huge when it comes to writing. Certainly not every piece of writing is going to benefit from an interview, but a lot of them will, actually. So think about if it'll work for your writing, and if it does, dive right in and start talking to people. In terms of interviewing though, big heads up, do a little research ahead of time. Write down some questions ahead of time, make sure they have a logical order, and respect that person's time. Doesn't mean you can't go off the cuff and dive in further, but be prepared for an interview. It's not a book or a web page that you can open up at 3 a.m. and just start working through. You have to respect that person's time and be prepared for them to cancel 2 or 3 times as well, and have to, well, maybe not cancel, but reschedule 2 or 3 times as well, so that you can roll with their busy life. Don't try and interview at the last minute. It's not going to work. That goes back to tip number 4 about speed, right? So there you have it. There's 5 principles that I took from journalism that have just changed the way I write in my classes and in my personal writing since taking those journalism classes. Personally, I would love to get into writing more feature-like pieces and more news pieces for local publications again, like I was for those classes. But even though I'm not doing that type of writing now, what I learned in those classes, I've been able to carry over, and it was so transformative and so beneficial for me. So if you get a chance to take a good journalism class, do it. But if not, I hope this video served you well. I'll see you in the next one. Get working on that assignment, and happy reading and writing.